Hello, Aaron Estrada here. In this lesson, we're going to cover the Roto node, the Roto paint node, and strategies for keeping your composite more efficient by proper management of the bounding box. It's a lot to cover, so let's get right into it. I'm going to create a Roto node by hitting O. And let's just start by looking at some of the basic controls. The first is the Select All tool, which is kind of the Swiss Army knife of manipulating pre-existing shapes. The next tool is the Add and Replace Points tool, and it's used for adding and removing points and modifying points on a pre-existing shape. In practice, you rarely really need it because the Select All tool can do almost everything it can do if you use the right hotkeys. The next tool down is the Create Shapes tool, which has several useful modes: Bezier, Cusp Bezier, B-spline, Ellipse, Rectangle, Cusp, Rectangle, and Open Spline, which is just a line with a thickness. It's very cool. So let's start by drawing a B-spline. It's a little different from maybe what you've seen with a Bezier type of shape. The B-spline works by interpolating the tension between these hulls on each shape. So as you can see, they kind of nicely interpolate on their own. Some people like this more than Bezier curves because they're a little easier to manage. There's less handles to worry about, and they smoothly interpolate no matter how you adjust them. If you'd like to change the tension of a particular CV, you can do that by holding down Control Shift and dragging left and right, which will adjust the tension on that CV so that you get a different interpolation along that curve. This is kind of like grabbing the handles on a Bezier and tweaking them, except for that you can't change the tangent. You can only change the tension in and out. If you'd like to create a soft edge on a shape like this, you can hold down Control and drag out, and that will create a feathered edge. I'm hitting Control Z to undo. Every shape also has overall feather controls that you can get to here in the Roto tab. So you can feather out and you can feather in as well using this control. There's also a fall off control that lets you adjust the attack or the attack of that fall off, sort of the gamma of how that's going to fall off. So regardless of whether you feather in or out, you have a lot of control by using this of exactly the sort of angle of that fall off, or rate of the fall off, I guess you could say. You can also change the fall off type here to be linear or smooth. So there's different looks that you can build in just based on this, the gradient type that it will pick. One of the interesting features of the B-spline is that if you're not happy with it, you can always convert it to a regular Bezier curve by right-clicking on it and selecting Convert B-spline to Bezier. So this will now convert to a Bezier curve with the maybe more familiar tangent handles that you can manipulate. To break the tangents on a Bezier, hold down Control and drag one of the handles. If you'd like to harden or cusp a Bezier, you can do that by holding down Shift Z, which will unsmooth it. If you'd like to smooth it, you can hold down, click Z on your keyboard, and that will increase the amount of smoothing on the Bezier. The Bezier also has feathered edges, so if I hold down Control and drag, you'll get a feathered edge. To reset the feather of a point, you can right-click it and select Reset Feather, or use the hotkey. I'm selecting this other point, which is Shift-E. If you'd like to smooth all of the points at the same time, you can hold down E, or any selected point. So I'm going to select all the points and I'm going to hit E, and this will progressively increase the amount of feather. or I can hold down Shift E and reset them all. Roto shapes can be keyframed at either the point level or the overall shape or transform level. So let's look at a useful sort of demonstration of what that means or what the implications of that are. I'm going to delete this shape by right-clicking it and selecting delete. Let's drop down a rectangle really quick. So I'm going to rotate this rectangle by lassoing all of the points, and if I hover outside it, you'll see I get a rotate cursor. Let's move the time slider a little bit to a different frame, let's say frame 31, and I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees. You'll notice that Nuke created a keyframe automatically for the points, all the points that were selected and moved. Now when I drag back in the timeline, well, let's see. That's not the motion I expected. Well, that's because Nuke is trying to interpolate the two positions of the keyframes through the most efficient or straightest path possible. This is the classic candy wrapping effect that'll happen when you twist objects in CG. So obviously keyframing the individual points was not the best strategy for rotation. It might have been an okay strategy for a translation type motion, or if I needed to move along with a deforming shape, but for rotation, it's not the best strategy. So to delete this keyframe, I'm going to go to this dialog, the spline key dialog here, and you can jump from keyframe to keyframe using these buttons. This is the first keyframe, this is the second keyframe. And if you need to delete a keyframe, you can hit the key with a negative next to it, and that will delete the keyframe that you're parked on. So now this doesn't have any keyframes. Let's use a different strategy for rotating this. I'm going to use the transform tab. So the rectangle already has a keyframe on frame 1. Let's just rotate it here using the transform widget. I'm going to transform it, or rotate it rather, 360 degrees. You'll notice that Nuke is now properly rotating the entire shape because it's transforming it in whole. So this is great when you need to do motions, translations and rotations where you want to maintain the shape of the roto shape you've generated as literally as possible with no deformation. So this is really a better strategy in that case. We aren't limited to a single level of transform. We can create layers. So I'm going to create a new layer here by clicking this plus key. And Nuke has created a new layer of transformation for me. I can use that to group shapes, or I can use it to create simple hierarchies for motion. In this case, let's use it to just create a hierarchy. I'm going to take my rectangle and I'm going to put it inside, and we'll just take this layer and we'll rotate it also, let's say, over time. So right click here, set key on rotate, move it to the end here, and then I'll rotate this shape moving the other direction, let's say 360 degrees. So now I've created a hierarchy of motion with one roto shape being driven by the layer that it's in. And you can build these as deep as you like. Right now there's no motion blur on this, so you see even though it's moving quite quickly, it's not producing motion blur. That is because motion blur has not been enabled for this shape, even though it appears as if it has been enabled for these layers. So let's turn motion blur on for this shape. Ah, there we go. Now we have motion blur. So that's the basics of the roto and transform. Let's look a little bit more at some of the details of keyframing particular shapes. So we'll start with a fresh shape. So I've created a circular shape. We're going to start by just creating a basic keyframe where we move this through time at the spline level. So I'm going to lasso, select all of these points and move them a little bit in time. You'll see we have this, and I'm going to take it and create a breakdown where I move them a little bit this way as well. There we go. See, I don't like this keyframe. Let's move it a little bit more this way. There we go. It's creating a sort of arc-like motion. Now, if we would like to see the motion curves, the animation curves for each individual spline point, we can right-click the selected points and go to the curve editor for those points. So I'm selecting curve editor points. We can now see the individual motion curves for each point. Here they are here. I'm going to collapse these so we're not looking at them. Curve points for our ellipse. So if you'd like, you can modify the individual curves for each point in the curve editor. It is a bit tedious. I wouldn't recommend this as a sort of standard workflow for keyframing. It's much easier to do it interactively in the viewport. But if you need very fine control, this might be a strategy you find yourself using where you edit the curves for individual points. Let's go back to the node graph. If you'd like to edit all of the keyframes by offsetting them by some amount, this is useful in the case of where you've done a lot of keyframe work, but you need to do a little nudge where you move everything over. You can use the ripple edit mode, which is this button here to enable it. Now, once you've turned on ripple edit, the way you use it is you need to pick a range. Let's say that we're going to do everything to the end from the frame that we're on. So we want to edit everything forward. And we're just going to move to the first keyframe, and we'll make the edit there. So I'm going to move my whole animation this way. Now, when ripple edit is enabled, what this means is I'm not just changing keyframe 1, I'm moving all of these keyframes with that offset. So let's turn that off and just look at what we did. You'll notice it's the same motion, but the whole thing has been offset by the amount that I ripple edited through the entire set. So this is useful, and it will work on a single point as well. So you can do this if you need to nudge in a single point through a whole amount of motion, and you can constrain the ripple edit to whatever range you think you're going to need it. So this is a great way of touching up a roto maybe after the fact without having to re-keyframe a million keyframes. Before we move on, let's take a quick look at the Open Spline tool. This tool is, as its name implies, an open shape, or meant to be used as an open shape. So you draw it as a line by clicking and dragging, similar to the Bezier tool. And when you're done, you can drop it by hitting Enter. Another option you have when you're building it, I'm going to undo by hitting Control-Z all the way back, is you can close it by clicking the last point. So you can also use this to create donut-like shapes if that is useful to you. Let's delete this. I'm going to right-click, delete. The Open Spline has some really useful controls. So I'm just going to create a simple one here. By clicking a point, you'll notice you get this purple and green handle. The green handle changes the size, the radius of the open spline, and the purple handle changes the feather. So it has feather controls. You also have the option of adjusting the overall width for the entire shape using this dialog here for the selected shape. So I'm middle clicking and dragging to change the number here. If you want to go by more coarse increments, you can hold down Shift, and if you want to go by more fine increments, you can hold down Control while you're dragging. So this is Shift, whole round numbers, and Control by tenths. And this works in any field, any number field, middle clicking and dragging.